good? You don't even use the mic for the camera, do you? You good? All right, cool. Yeah, you guys can't hear me, just yell, but I'll try to project. All right, so you guys might remember I presented with Matt Sullivan last fall, and we did kind of a more technical talk then. Obviously, Matt's a pen tester. That's kind of my background for a little bit. But one thing that I thought about when I was kind of where you are when I was in school is that you never really got the other side of it. Because pen testing is fun, but you can't necessarily do that for the next 50 years of your career, right? And it is potentially 50 years these days. And I wish that I had had kind of a better perspective about the kind of the business side of the equation too, and kind of this leadership management side of it. So hopefully that's something that at least some of you guys are interested in, and not too boring. But it is what I'm doing now. I direct the InfoSec program at Workiva. I've been there for about 3.5 years. And I can, as I go through these slides, I can kind of say a little bit about how I got there if you're curious. But I just kind of wanted to talk to you about what that's like, what some of the challenges are, what kind of some of the data we've seen in terms of how people get there, why they get there, et cetera, are. So like I said, I have slides that go through these, but by all means, please jump in if you have questions throughout the talk. Don't feel bad about interrupting. Don't be just thrown on for however long it takes.
No problem.
Perfect. Any questions yet? Yes.
I don't know if this is on like the next slide or whatever, but
yeah.
I've seen Workiva a lot, but I don't know what they do.
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, I was just in Ames. I just kind of take it for granted. Yeah, so Workiva used to be web filings, if that rings any bells. So we're a software company that back in 2008 started as web filings. Then back then was just doing SEC filings. And what I mean by that is they wrote it's kind of like Google Docs / like TurboTax on steroids, which is, I don't know, probably doesn't make sense. But basically, it's kind of like this online productivity suite that if you're an accountant, you can go into. You can make all your financial documents. You can link them. You can check them. You can tag them with all the special tagging you have to do for XBRL and EDGAR and all these standards. And then you can send them directly to the SEC and have those filed instantaneously with the government. The reason that was a big advantage is because the process before that was very manual, like sending spreadsheets back and forth, sending Word docs back and forth. The .final, .really this time, .1, .v2, .docx type thing, like that process. If you guys have been through that. That's what these guys were dealing with. And so web filings came in and kind of basically disrupted that space and gave them this completely online, collaborative, real-time solution to do that instead. And then since then, the company has grown to the point where Wdesk is what we now call the product. Wdesk does a lot of other things besides that. SEC filings kind of got us off the ground, but now it gets used for all sorts of things. And we're actually working on some really cool technologies right now that will let us do a lot more large, complex data sets, way beyond what Excel, Google Docs, those types of things could handle. And not just in terms of size, but in terms of the way data is kind of interconnected. So you can start doing some really cool things around like relationships. We're trying to do some things with graph databases, semantic linking, that type of stuff. Just some really cool technologies that typically you probably wouldn't see applied to a business space, but you've got a software company that's like half software geeks and half business geeks, and like accounting geeks. So combine those two and you end up with these really cool solutions that no one really ever thought about. So yeah, we changed our name to Workiva 2 years ago, just to reflect the fact that it's really more than just filings, it's a lot more now. And we went public in December of 2014, so we're a publicly traded company now. Right? Okay, any other questions? I like that there was a question right off the bat. Perfect. Okay, so what's it like running an InfoSec program? Well, it's like being Moses or General MacArthur. No, not really. Not at all. Because number one, there is no, here are the things you should do for InfoSec. No one knows. We're just making this shit up as we go along. That's InfoSec, let me be honest. And number two, if you think you're going to have the authority, you can just walk in a room and say, I'm InfoSec and you have to do this because I said so. Yeah, good luck. Right? If you find the company where you have that kind of authority, call me, I'll apply. Because I don't know any security people that have that kind of authority, right? But in terms of the kind of the jobs that I'm talking about when I talk about leading security programs, these are kind of the titles that you'd see, right? InfoSec manager, director, CISO or ISO. So some companies, for example, Principal Financial Group, they have a CISO, and then their different business units have what they call business ISOs that report up to them. Sometimes companies will have just the ISO in different departments to kind of delegate some of that authority. Or a chief security officer, and typically the difference between a CISO and a CSO, CISO is usually how people pronounce Chief Information Security Officer. Usually the difference is that a CSO is typically going to be somebody with like a military law enforcement background that is also responsible for things like physical security or executive protection, meaning bodyguarding your executives, disaster planning, like if somebody bombs the building, that type of stuff. And a CISO is going to be more responsible for the kind of IT side of it. But of course, there's a lot of overlap, and I'll come back to that in a second. One of the most controversial things right now, though, about these positions is where they report. And it's all about conflict of interest, separation of duties, if you guys know what I mean by that. Basically what I mean is, it's the most common place for a CISO, manager, director, whatever, of security to report is to who is ever in charge of IT, right? Your CIO, VP, director, whatever. And in a lot of ways, functionally, that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, this is where I report to IT. Functionally, it makes a lot of sense because, hey, the people that are in charge of your information technology should probably be the ones that are in charge of information security because they know the most about it, right? They have the best understanding of what infrastructure we're running, what applications, what software we're writing, etc. So I mean, it's great from that perspective. The problem is, if your VP of IT, it's one morning, it comes down to like, man, we've got this huge vulnerability, and if we don't shut down this server right now, it's going to get exploited, and there's a really good chance that we're going to get hacked, we're going to be the front page of the New York Times, and we're just sunk, right? But if we do take it down, well, now these customers can't buy our product or whatever, and we're going to lose $10 million because we took it down, right? IT's job is to keep services up and running and meet user requirements. Security's job is to keep bad things from happening, okay? So if you've got one person that's got both of those responsibilities on top of each other, I mean, what's the right call there, right? And if one person has to make that decision, how are they going to make it? Well, they're going to decide which one affects my bonus more. And if you're the VP of IT, probably keeping things up is more important than keeping it secure. So it can be seen as a conflict of interest. Now at Workiva, my boss and I have a really good relationship, but I think we managed this really well. And I actually have a kind of a dotted line to our COO, President Marty. So I think we managed it pretty well. But there are a lot of people that would say, kind of looking at the way financial auditing happens, you can't do that, right? Like you need to at least report to an executive, the CEO or the COO. That's a little bit better. But even the CEO and COO have some of that same conflict, right? I mean, they don't want things to be down, right? For a publicly traded company, the only kind of independent people that really can take that long-term view about what's best for the company is your board of directors, right? So typically your board of directors, they shouldn't be too financially intertwined in the company. They're supposed to be independent, right? Now in reality that happens to different degrees, but so from a financial perspective, most boards of directors have what's called an audit committee. And if you're a financial auditor, that's probably where you report. Or you might have a director of audit that reports to the board and people report there, right? That isn't very common at all for information security now. I mean, it's probably at least a third in IT, probably about a third in the CEO and the COO or something equivalent, right? And then, I mean, board of directors and others is just kind of some other companies down there too, right? But I mean, there are places that reports to the CFO, right, the financial officer, or the general counsel, or some other place in the company. Maybe even reports to a CSO, right? It could be a hierarchy there. So it really just depends on the company. But like I said, it's very controversial, and no one's really decided what the right answer is. Because in the financial world, you've got standards from the American Institute of CPAs that say this is what it means to be independent, this is what it means to be qualified, and if you don't meet these, you can't audit the company. And there's no equivalent of that in the IT security space, so we're just kind of, like I said, making this up as we go along. I'm not going to go over this in a lot of detail, but I found this pie chart, I don't know, like 6 or 7 years ago, and I just keep coming back to it because I think it's a really good representation of what, I mean, this is called the CSO connector, so it's maybe a little bit broad, but it's a good kind of picture of what, at kind of an executive level, from a security point of view, the types of things you might be worried about, right, or the types of people you're going to work with, right? And you say, I already mentioned some of these, right, your CFO, legal, COO, of course you work with HR, personnel, marketing, product officer, privacy officer in that case, or product officer. So all different parts of the company potentially have an impact in terms of protecting the company or what they might do that could hurt the company. And you kind of got them involved across the spectrum, right? I mean, even things like you might not think that like OSHA would be a security thing, right? But I mean, safety. OSHA is making sure that you don't have people using unsafe ladders and they're clipped in and they're climbing towers and stuff like that. And that's not directly security, but safety and security are very much interwoven. So you end up finding yourself pulled into a lot of areas even if you are just within IT, you tend to kind of be the security expert, which sometimes people interpret as safety expert, and you get pulled into other things as well. But more kind of tactically, in terms of what's a typical day or what actual tasks are you doing, it's all about basically just trying to stay up with what's going on and keep bad things from happening, right? So, I mean, this is kind of a loop you go through, okay? Because every day you come to work, it's like, well, who's trying to hack us today, right? And how is that? What bad things can happen because of that? Okay. Oh, and by the way, what is the business doing today? Like, what is the chief marketing officer putting on the website today? Right? Is somebody in the marketing office, did they decide it was a good idea to put a Wi-Fi password on the website today? Who knows, right? I mean, companies do stupid things all the time. Okay. So you've got this constantly changing landscape, both in terms of what the company's doing and in terms of what the risks are. Right? And on top of that, there's a lot of confusion right now around what should you be doing for security. Have any of you guys been following the stuff going on in Europe lately with privacy?
Some.
Yeah, a couple of you kind of. So basically, no one knows right now, if you're a US company and you want to do business in Europe, what information can you store? Does it have to be stored in Europe? Does it have to be encrypted? Do you have to give them the ability to have a request to remove that information? Can you even do business in Europe? The whole safe harbor framework that was set up for this completely fell apart. One judge in Europe said, that agreement that's been around for 10 years that let all of these companies, not just companies like Workiva, but companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Google, Amazon, do business in Europe, one judge decided, no, that's not valid anymore, threw it out. And for the last 3 or 4 months, all of these companies, Workiva included, have been going, well, great, then someone please tell us what the rules are because we don't want to get sued. And no one really knows yet. Okay? It's not just international. I mean, even within the U.S., there's a lot of different standards. On the federal side, you see NIST used a lot. That's a pretty good framework for what you should be doing. But it's not necessarily an audit. And audits are good because they help other people get reassurance that you're doing an exact set of things. Right? I mean, you could have the perfect security, the best security of any of your competitors, but without an audit, your customers are basically just taking your word that you're doing those things. Okay? But the problem is then, well, which audit do you do? And if you're in certain industries, like for example, if you're a hospital, then HIPAA, the Health Information Protection Portability Act or something like that, HIPAA, by the way, HIPAA, not HIPPO, common typo, I'll just throw your resume out. So, I mean, if you're in certain industries, it's very clear, right? Or if you're Target, you have to follow PCI, and then you get screwed anyway, but at least you tried. Other companies, so like, for example, Workiva, we're publicly traded, so we have to follow Sarbanes-Oxley from kind of an accounting perspective, but we're not dealing with healthcare information, we're not dealing with credit card information, we're not dealing with classified information or energy information or any of these other types of regulated information. So we have to decide what audits do we want to subject ourselves to make our customers comfortable, and basically figure out what our customers' consensus is on that.
I mean, you guys don't deal with necessarily credit card information, but do you deal with even more secure information than that?
Yeah, I mean, so we deal with pre-release financials, which I would definitely argue is more sensitive than credit card information. An example we like to use in orientation, Google is now one of our customers. We've been trying to sign them for a while and couldn't. What finally got Google to drop the company they were with previously and sign with web filings at that time was that that previous company accidentally filed Google's 10K, their annual report, 2 hours early. Okay, so just 2 hours early. That cost Google stockholders $26 billion. Okay? Gone. Okay? So it's very, very sensitive information. But if you're the company that's publicly traded, like Workiva, you've got to adhere to Sarbanes-Oxley because that says what financial controls you have to adhere to make sure your CFO isn't cooking the books and your accountant isn't making up numbers and all these other things. But if you're now a company that, like, yeah, we adhere to that for our information, but now we're holding financial information for 2,000 plus other companies, there's really no clear audit that covers that. So you kind of have to figure out what the customers want to see. Really, I mean, so it's changing all the time. There really are no right answers. And then, of course, you've got people in things, right? Like, this would be hard enough if you just had technology, right? At least computers typically don't reconfigure themselves, right? Computers don't typically download ransomware and get their laptop encrypted by themselves, right? That's typically a person involved. So, as much as you might want to avoid that dimension of it, the people side is very much part of it too. Okay. And then there's this whole question of, okay, great, there's all this bad stuff that could happen or is happening or we know, has happened, whatever it might be. That's great, but we're trying to run a business here, okay? And the point of a business is to make somebody money, right? Or maybe it's not a business, right? Maybe, if you're not into the financial, making millions side of things, even if it's the government, right? You've got information you have to protect, et cetera. You still got stakeholders of some kind. You have to provide a service. And so, you guys have probably heard this analogy about the only perfect computer is one that's turned off and locked in the safe, right? From a security perspective. That's exactly it. I mean, you have to make decisions constantly about yes, we could implement this security feature, but it's going to cost us 6 months of time to implement. It's going to cost us $1 million in labor. Is it really mitigating a risk that much? And then you have to try to decide, how much money could we lose if that actually happened, which we have to quantify and make that trade-off. And that's kind of that business side of it that you have to apply to it, because when you're talking to your executives or your board or whatever it might be, you have to be able to explain it to them in those terms. Because if I go up to my board member and say, oh my God, there's this 0 day and the Samba has this bad lock bug, and if we don't apply it, they can man in the middle of our SMB traffic. Do you think the board has any idea what the hell I'm talking about? No. Okay, is that going to cost me money? Right? Are we going to lose customers over that? Is the stock price going to drop over that? What the hell are you talking about? Right? So you've got to be able to speak both sides of it. Bad lock today, by the way. If you haven't seen it, go check that out. Although apparently it was overhyped. Surprise.
This got really QB.
Yeah. If you don't know the story behind that, just quick aside. So bad lock was this balloon that dropped today. Like a month ago, they said it was going to drop. The guy who said it was going to drop works for a company in Germany that got some publicity out of this. The guy that announced it or supposedly discovered it, if you go look in GitHub for the code for Samba, the lock.c file, the last commit is by him. He is the major contributor for the locking in Samba for the bad lock bug. So we'll do that. That is that. Yeah. Okay, so you got all these cost questions, and then there's this response as well, which of course you hope not to have to deal with. But I heard a really good analogy at a class I was in December out in DC, because security people, we like to think no, we're never going to get hacked. It's going to be if we get hacked, it's the end. It's over. We all go home. We're dead. Whatever. It just can't happen. But I mean, really, the way security works these days is think of it this way: is there even the best NFL football team, even the best lawyer, they still lose games. They still lose trials, right? Nobody gets it right every time, and security is no different. So incident response becomes really, really important, because you have to be able to not only detect when something went wrong, but you have to be able to respond very quickly and minimize the damage. And that can be really hard to get time and energy behind, because it's one of those what-if situations. Right? It's like backups, right? Oh man, we're going to spend $1,000 on backups. We'll never need that. It's the same type of thing, right? Until somebody deletes the payroll file, oh good, $1,000. Yeah, here you go. Is that enough? Right? So that can be kind of hard, but it's really important. And then, Alec and I are going to talk about this. And then there's number 4. That's great. You've decided all these things. You've got all this data. You've decided, yes, these are exactly the things we should do. I have all the data. I can make an argument. You still got to go convince some other human to do it, right? Like I said, there aren't many companies. Maybe the military is one, but there aren't many organizations where security gets that godlike power of because I said so. Right? It just really doesn't happen. And then you repeat that the next day, right? On and on and on. Right? It's constantly, you're kind of running to keep up. Which, on the one hand, I mean, people like me, that's why I do this, right? Yes, it's challenging, but every day I'm learning something new, right? I'm never bored, right? I cannot think of a single day at Workiva I've ever been bored. On the other hand, a real issue in the profession is burnout. And that's pretty serious, right? I mean, there's studies that say, that's not really right ahead, but some studies say CISO tenure averages 18 months. Some CISOs, and by the study, the average CISO only makes 18 months at a company. I think that's probably a little bit low. I've been at Workiva 3.5 years, and I haven't gone crazy yet, as far as I know. But it's very stressful, and you have to be able to manage that. So there's definitely some kind of personal coping, emotional intelligence type skills as well to become part of it, which were not my forte going in, and I have been developing. It's a challenge. Questions about that stuff? All right. So I already talked about some of this, but there's a lot of gray area. Things change. It's this whole concept of asymmetric warfare. Right? If you guys haven't heard this, what we're talking about is, if this is World War II, right? The question is, who can get more tanks and soldiers and blow up more of the other guy's people, right? It's symmetric, right? Everything, like you can buy a tank, I can buy a tank, we're on even footing, right? In terms of how much money we have. In cybersecurity, that's not the case. You know, the 17-year-old Russian I'm referring to, the Target breach, which was arguably the largest retail breach. Of course, there's some challenges to that now. That was a 17-year-old Russian that just happened to phish some contractor for Target that, if you don't know this really, basically was their HVAC vendor, right? The company that controls the heating, cooling, refrigeration, all that stuff at the Target stores. Phished some employee of that contractor, got over the network of the stores, and took over all the cash registers, or infected them anyway. Right? 17-year-old! Okay. Fortune 500, they had been PCI audited. They had a CISO. This is a huge company, right? Fortune 100 company. I think I say 500. I think Target's actually Fortune 100, right? And still, a single 17-year-old could overcome all of that. That is asymmetric, right? Because who had more resources in that situation? And it's that whole concept, like I said, of having to be right every time, or something like that can happen, which is why I thought this response. Right. And culture is challenging too, right? I mean, at Workiva, this is a challenge because we're a very loose company. We're a startup culture. People don't like a lot of process. They don't like a lot of rules. Other companies, I mean, if you go work at DoD, for example, right? It is very regimented, and this wouldn't be much of a challenge because you've got 250 years of rules and regulations that are put into place for the military, and if you don't follow those, you get court-martialed, and that's the end of it, right? So it kind of depends on the company. Banks tend to be pretty strict as well. It just kind of depends on the sector. But you really have to be careful because if every time someone comes to you and says like, "Hey, we're going to install this on our laptop," and you're the guy that always says no, do you think they're going to keep coming to you, or are they just going to find a way to bypass you in the future? And it used to be maybe 5 or 10 years ago that, okay, great, we're going to put in a DLP, and we're going to put in an application firewall, and we're going to take away local admin on the laptops, and they'll never be able to downstall all this stuff, right? Today, like, Slack is a perfect example. Are you guys familiar with Slack? Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of you are. So, you can install it, but I can just do it in a browser. And if I want to block it, well, maybe I can block the DNS, but I've got to block star.slack.com, which means if my company wants to use it at all, no, we can't. And by the way, it's hosted on EC2, so I can't block it based on IPs, or I block everything else that's in Amazon, which these days is pretty much everything, right? So you have to really find a way to become like, how can we help you do this person, right? Like, don't get me wrong, there are times somebody comes here and it's like, you're out of your mind, like, no freaking way. That happens, but that has to be the minority of cases if people just want to work with you. Yeah, I realize now these slides back to back is just kind of like a bad news parade, so I'm sorry, but I'll get to the rest of these here, and then we'll talk about something else in a minute. And metrics is tough too. So when you're talking about like reporting to the board, etc., if you're a CFO, your head of accounting came to you, or head of finance came to you, and said like, yeah, we made a lot of money this quarter, we're doing great. I mean, what's your next question going to be? How much money did you make? Right? And how much money did you spend? And how much more money could we have made? And how could we have done that? And how are we going to make more money next quarter? Right? That's just how you run a business. But security people, like even me, it's hard, right? With as many different as we manage. I go to the board. It's like, yeah, we haven't gotten hacked yet. It's great. And here's some things we're doing. Like, great. Like, how are you going to keep us from getting hacked in the future? How do you know this is effective? How do you know that the money you're spending on this team and these solutions? How do you know you're spending money on the right things? How do we know we're getting better? Like, would you even know if somebody tried to phish you and failed? Like, how do you even detect some of this stuff? So there's and if any of you guys are interested in starting grad school and looking for projects, or in grad school looking for projects, this whole concept of security metrics is a really interesting, really hard problem that people are working on, but no one has a good answer yet, right? Because how do you measure risk? How do you measure expected loss for a cyber event? There's a whole industry, if you guys aren't aware of this, that sells cyber insurance. So for example, Workiva carries a policy. I don't know how much we carry, but we carry a cyber insurance policy. This is if we get breached up to some amount, the insurance company will cover the costs of lawyers and notifying our customers and cover some of the lawsuits we get put under. But there's a cap on that, right? And the insurance company has to decide how much to charge us for that. And how do they decide? They've got to have that same data. And a lot of the studies that are out there, they're starting to get a little bit better now, but still a lot of them, they're just like crap from a statistics point of view. So it's like, okay, like You 3, did you get hacked this year? Great. Okay, how many records did you lose? Great. How much did that cost you? Great. Okay, 3 of you, there's 20 in the room, so we'll take 3, so 2 and a third. Okay, so this much money was lost by the economy this year. It's like, you can't do that. That's not how statistics work. So some companies, I mean, Verizon actually has a really good, it's the data breach incident report they release every year. That's my favorite right now. Symantec has a pretty good one as well. Are getting better at collecting this data. But the problem is, if you're a company and Verizon comes to your door and says, hey, we're doing a study. Did you get breached this year? Like, no, of course not. Who told you you got breached? Companies don't want to volunteer the information if they can help it. So it's kind of hard to build data around that. And I already talked about kind of speaking between IT and non-IT, so I won't drill into that anymore. But just to underscore, I mean, it's as much a business issue as it is a technology issue. Questions about that? All right. So talking to humans, I talked about this. Let me check. Yeah, okay, next one is the one I was thinking. And this is a really important one as well because, like I said, I mean, you can't just do this by yourself. So for me, this is kind of like learn from Ben's mistakes. Coming out as an engineer, having been a sysadmin, having been very technically focused, and then going into a role where like, hey, there's this company that makes $140 million a year, and there's 1,200 people that work here, and yeah, go get them to do security stuff. Like, it's just a train wreck, right? Like, hey, you do this. Yeah, I'm mad at you, do stuff. Doesn't work. Like, you have to develop a lot of these skills that we just don't learn as engineers. And maybe you're a natural at it, right? And maybe this is something that comes naturally to you. That's great. But most people in engineering and IT, I think we all agree, this probably doesn't come very naturally to most of us. And it's really, really important. I mean, early on in my time at Workiva, I had several like painful and very large run-ins with people that blew out of proportion, and had to learn to really kind of handle people better than that. I've got some book recommendations at the end. There's a couple of them that speak to this a little bit, but I don't want to go like way off on a tangent on this, but I just wanted to throw it in there because this is one that doesn't really get much attention in terms of like formal training, and it's just impossible to overstate the importance of it in terms of being successful in this area. But yeah, so why does anybody do this? Well, this is why people do this. Okay? Now, there's a lot of variables. Okay? Like, where do you live? What certifications do you have? How much experience do you have? Are you working in the public sector or the private sector? Are you a well-known name? Have you worked at a company that's been through a breach? There's all sorts of variables, right? But just picking two kind of somewhat reputable sources for salary information, looking at these salaries, like, okay, yeah, I can deal with that. Like that's not so bad. Right? But I mean, it's because, and we'll talk about this, but it's because there aren't enough people that want to be CISOs, directors of security, etc. There just aren't enough people trained for that. The people that are, this is a lot of studies saying now one of the bigger problems is it's not only that not enough people are trained, it's the people that are trained are burning out and leaving the industry. So you end up with this whole supply and demand thing that really drives salaries up. And it's just a very important role right now. So these are ranges, and like I said, there's a lot of variables. I wouldn't necessarily take these and use them in your salary negotiations or anything. Robert Half in particular tends to be a little bit inflated sometimes, and that 222 number is probably like if you're a CISO in Manhattan. But Des Moines around the average, somewhere in the middle of that. I would expect might be typical around here. So yeah, there you go. Just thought I'd throw that out there. A lot of bad news, but I mean, there's a reason people do this. And by the way, it's not just management careers that pay well in security. All security careers are very much in demand and pay very well right now. I've seen a lot of stats. I don't know what the most recent ones are, but I've seen stats that say things like there are twice as many open security positions, or I guess like taking the CISSP certification, for example. There are twice as many open positions that say they require a CISSP certification than there are people who currently hold CISSPs. Open positions that haven't been filled. So, talk about supply and demand, right? Econ 101, anyone, right? Supply and demand, that kind of drives this.
In the past 3 years, the unemployment rate in DC for cybersecurity engineers,
right,
and surrounding area as well, has been 0.
Yeah, unemployment security is pretty much unheard of, right? Unless you've really done something wrong, right? It's pretty much impossible to not be employed in security. I guess I shouldn't say that because there are other variables, but yeah, it's very much in demand. Okay, in terms of education, so I know this group has typically been kind of heavy on the computer-y side. Are all of you guys computer-y? Okay, so MIS as well, maybe? CS? Couple of CS? Anything else, like poli-sci, business, accounting, any of those?
MIS.
MIS. What's that?
SC.
I see software engineering. Yes, thank you. That's software engineering. Yes, yeah, so that's a pretty common mix. And I mean, if you look at, this was a study that Digital Guardian did based on Fortune 50, I think, CISOs. But yeah, I mean, comp sci, computer E, and those related ones are a very big portion of people that are getting these areas. For obvious reasons, it's a very technology-heavy area. And in some places, like Iowa State, computer E and comp sci are separate. In some schools, they're the same thing, right? They might use them interchangeably. So you can take that. But the other one is business. So the MIS side of it is important. But not necessarily even just MIS, even things like an MBA, where those types of business as well are pretty important. Okay? The master's obviously helps, and I think anymore, that's because, I mean, 40%, this is current CISOs, which means typically people like in their 40s. I would say that's going to become more common, that's just my personal opinion, because the bachelor's, the undergrad tends to be pretty broad, and then the master's specializes in that. So I think a lot of the open positions I see and the postings we make, we say, if not required, at least prefer a master's degree as well. Right? And then there's this crazy group of us like me that have got bored and did something higher. So I have a PhD. I work with Doug. So I've done that. That's pretty uncommon. And you know, like before I went to Workiva, talking to the companies, like I remember my John Deere interview. And I'll just pick on John Deere. Did any of you work for John Deere? Perfect. Okay. So I had just had interviews over in the MU with a couple of guys. And I sat down, I think it was their autonomous systems group. Nice guys. But they looked at my resume and they go, PhD, computer engineering. Tell me about the philosophy of computers. I'm like, oh, okay. Let's back up like 20 steps and come back into this. So yeah, I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's pretty uncommon. My personal opinion, so I mean, the master's program we have here at InFast is a very good program, very good reputation. For me personally, I kind of wish instead of doing the PhD, I had done an MBA. Whether it was Iowa State or not, I don't know. But I think the MBA might have been more useful for me than the PhD. But I wouldn't necessarily say that displaces the InFast Masters, because I think that's really important too. Okay, but yeah, I mean, I literally have known people that do security stuff that come from all sorts of different areas. So it doesn't mean that this is what you have to do. It just tends to be what is most common. All right, questions? And then I mentioned the CISSP. So if you're not familiar with this kind of whole racket, okay, so there's going to school, which is great, and then you get out of school and people are like, great, you have 3 PhDs. Do you have a CISSP? God, great. So certifications, this is the closest thing we have to passing the bar, or getting a CPA certification, or being part of the medical association. This is the closest thing we have. And there's no one certification that everybody has these days, right? I mean, because like, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be licensed as a lawyer, you have to pass the bar in the state where you want to practice. I mean, that's from reciprocity, but like if you don't pass the bar, you're not a lawyer, right? And once you pass the bar, there's codes of ethics you have to follow. If you violate those, you can lose your license, you can be kicked out of the bar. There's all these kind of, this community and this structure around that profession in the law. Accounting is the same way, medicine is the same way, some areas of engineering are the same way. Like civil engineering, for example. I think I have that on a later slide too. But in IT, we don't necessarily have that much unity in terms of the profession. And skipping ahead a little bit, I'll talk about this more later, but it's because it's such a new profession, right? I mean, IT security has really only been around 2, 3, arguably maybe a little bit longer decades. So there's still kind of some consensus developing about this, around this. CISSP does tend to be the most common one. It's also, in my opinion, from that list, it's probably the hardest. So I did that. I spent about 6 months studying for that. The CISSP is challenging because it's very broad, but it's not only broad, it's also very deep, right? So, like this business stuff we're talking about tonight, like risk management, cost-benefit analysis, that type of stuff, that's on there. Like how should you configure radius for your Wi-Fi network? That's on there. What type of fire extinguisher do you use to put out a metal fire? That's on there. I mean, it's very broad, but that's why it's well respected. I believe, if I remember correctly, for federal positions, in a lot of cases, maybe this is becoming almost a requirement for a lot of federal security positions now, because it's pretty well respected.
Which one?
CSSP.
They do like their own certifications.
Okay, so they meant some internal ones. But I would say, in terms of security in general, CISSP is kind of the closest thing we have right now to a bar exam, but it's by no means the majority. It just tends to be the one that you hear about the most. CISM also, that's a little bit more focused on the business side. Those are the only two I've gone through. ITIL really depends on what kind of company you're going to be working for. So if you're going to go work for a larger, more established company, a bank, a principal financial group, these really big IT operations that are very service-oriented in their mindset, ITIL is kind of the thing that will expect you to know. This is things like project management and service level agreements and how to resolve issues and incidents and all that stuff. Okay. If you're going to work for a smaller company or a newer company, more of a cloud-focused company like Workiva, ITIL, no one's going to know what you're talking about. So it kind of depends on the industry. CISA isn't typically one that people like us do. Some of us do. But this tends to be people that come up from an accounting background and want to do the audit side of it, but want to have an IT focus, do the CISA. And by the way, the names after the dashes are the organizations that sponsor these. ISC Square doesn't have a local chapter, but ISACA does have a local chapter down in Des Moines, local. And if you're interested, we're actually doing a summer seminar that I'm coordinating this summer. That'll focus on cybersecurity, audit, risk management, and network security. So if you want more information on that, hit me up. And we're talking about potentially getting study groups together for some of these certs. So if you're going to be in the area, that's what we want to do, talk to me. I will say, I guess I'm talking about C-risk yet. I don't know as much about that, but that's also pretty common. That's more of the risk management side. Most of these have an experience requirement, right? And typically, they'll let you substitute a master's degree or a PhD for maybe 1 or 2 years of that requirement. But typically, you've got to have 3, in some cases 4 or 5 years of experience before you can get the certification, in addition to passing the exam, typically having a sponsor in most of these. So keep that in mind as well. And you can just check out these websites, get more information about them. Okay. But if you wait until, if you're in a job that doesn't require it, or apply for a job that doesn't require it, but a company where that's valued, a lot of companies will either pay to help you get it, right, paying for the preparation or the exam, or if you already have it or they won't pay for the exam, it's really common for them to pay your annual dues, right? Because most of them have this annual requirement in terms of paying dues, which go to your local chapter usually, as well as the national organization or international, in the case of these. And they also have a continuing education requirement, which if you're in school, obviously would be easy, but with the experience requirement, maybe you can't quite go for these yet. But once you're out in the workforce, you've got to peel 40 hours a year, which might not sound like a lot. That's a whole week of your job you've got to take every year for each one of these certs to maintain that certification, right? So go to the conference, take the class, whatever it might be. Kind of depends. I mean, ISC Squared, if you write a book, that counts for 40 hours. Like, I feel like I should get more than 40 hours for that, but all right. So it kind of depends. What's that?
Volume 1.
Yeah, volume 1. Yeah, I think I got the 40 hours for my dissertation because they count that as a book. Like, all right, I'll take that. And typically, if you have CISSP and the CISM, typically you can double count those education credits. But if you've got CISM and the CISA, they'll probably make you do 80 hours a year. If they don't usually let you overlap in the same group. And so you'll see these on job postings a lot of times. And a lot of times, it kind of depends on the company, but like if you look at the Robert Half guide, for example, it'll say here are the salaries for the security positions, and then the footnotes it'll say add X% for CISSP, add X% for CISA, etc. So they do, in some companies, they do have a pretty direct correlation with salary. But I would really like to see the industry get to the point where there is kind of a bar that you have to pass to be in security for a lot of reasons. And I think we're kind of headed that direction. Okay. Questions about those? And by the way, there are lots of other certs. These are just the most common ones. Right? If you want to focus on pen testing, I could have a whole other 3 slides about pen testing certs. Right? It's a whole bunch of them. So just kind of an example, because one thing that I have never seen a really good example of is kind of this roadmap. Like, okay, I want to be a CISO in 15 years. What should I be doing now? What should I be doing in 5 years? What should I be doing in 10 years? How do I get there? So this is just kind of one example, which kind of aligns with what I did, more or less. But I mean, there are lots of ways to get there. I think this is a pretty common progression, right? People tend to start in IT, maybe like help desk or kind of a tier 1 position, a support position. And as they get more specialized, they might move into a sysadmin or a network admin role, or maybe a developer role, or maybe they start as developers, right? That's pretty common progression. And really the line between sysadmin, network admin, and pen tester or vulnerability assessment, that type of stuff, is really getting blurry these days. Because, I mean, take bad luck, for example. if you're a sysadmin, what were you doing today? You were dealing with a security vulnerability all day long. You were patching all your Windows servers, right? And you've got to be on top of that stuff. You've got to know what's vulnerable. And your security people, your auditors, internal and external, are constantly going to be asking you, how are you protecting these systems? How are you auditing them yourselves? How are you controlling the configuration, everything else? So, being a sysadmin and a network admin or a developer, as you kind of get more senior, get more kind of autonomy, it just kind of becomes part of your job that you have to be thinking about security all the time. So it's pretty natural that a lot of people kind of move from there into a pen test type role, right? They might do it inside at the same company, right? So at Workiva, we've got kind of 4.5 full-time pen testers. And Maxwell was one of them, and some others. Or you can do this as a consulting firm. So one of the guys that works for us at Workiva, Eric, before he came to Workiva, he spent about 9 years doing consulting work for pen testing. So the company he worked for, he literally went around on contracts to different banks and pen tested all their banking applications. He became kind of an expert in like the banking regulations, banking software. Like he could tell you who writes usbank.com's website. He could tell you all that stuff because that was kind of his specialty in that consulting firm. And there's lots of companies that will do this, right? I mean, I know PricewaterhouseCoopers spends a lot of time here on campus. They're always recruiting. They do a lot of this type of stuff. But there's tons and tons of companies that do this. Some of them are big, like PwC. Some of them are small, right? I mean, there are companies that we work with and do pen tests with. It might be 5 guys. There's a company in Ankeny that's great. We love it, Integrity Technology. It's like 5 guys in the office in Ankeny. So there's a whole kind of array of things you can do there. But as you get more senior, you kind of move this kind of team lead or analyst role where you're really specializing on this. And that, I mean, sometimes depending on the company, you might kind of be a de facto manager or leader in that role. And they kind of move into leadership. Okay, and then, I mean, this is kind of the, like I said, this is kind of the track I took. I'm happy, offline, answer more questions about that. But by no means is this a, end-all, be-all blueprint. There are lots of ways to get there. Okay. Thoughts about that? Any of you guys disagree with that? Agree with that? See anything different? Yeah. I think it's pretty common. Okay. So other than the salary, why would you want to do this? Okay, because obviously, as you can tell, I kind of had that bad news parade at the beginning. It's a stressful job, and you have to manage that. But in addition to the pay, I mean, pay is great, but if you're stressed out all the time and not getting any value out of it, what's the big deal, right? I mean, for our age group, it's pretty well known that beyond the salary, one of the really important things to people our age is that we don't just want to make a paycheck. Like we actually want to do something that means something, right? Like I don't want to just go clock in, clock out, and that be it. Like I want my work to actually mean something. And so this is definitely a career where you can do that, right? So I mean, yeah, like I said, it's in demand. There aren't very many qualified candidates who get salaries, but it's a chance to constantly be learning, be challenged, and really become a trusted person in the organization you're working in, right? I mean, how many people so I guess Workiva is kind of an anomaly because a lot of people is there, but typically security's got very open access to pretty much anyone in the company, right? They go to the board meetings, they sit in on executive meetings, they go talk to HR and accounting and legal, and they find out about things very early. So it's it's a great position to be in the company because you have that chance to be very influential. But on top of that, serving these organizations, technology is just, as you guys know, it's complicated stuff, right? That's why you spend 4, 5, 8 years going to school to learn about this stuff because it's very complicated. And not everybody understands this stuff. I mean, boards of directors sure as hell don't understand this stuff. Okay, it depends on the company, but in general, you don't have cybersecurity people sitting on boards these days. You probably don't have IT people sitting on boards in most cases. So they need this help, and there's this whole dimension. I mean, so I always say security is kind of this combination of what I call the white knight syndrome. Okay, like you want to be the person to come in and like protect the damsel in distress, right? But okay, replace damsel with like your company or your shareholders or whatever. But it's kind of that thing where you want to be the person protecting, helping protect the company. Okay, and again, I mentioned earlier, like the bottom line doesn't necessarily do it for everyone. I get that, but there's still, I mean, even like Workiva, even if I wasn't bought into Workiva, or even if I'm jaded about the customers we have, those customers still have customers, right? Like if my grandma is a customer of JP Morgan Chase, who's one of our major customers, and she gets breached because of something that we did, because of information JPMC put in our system, I've got some obligation to her down the line to try to make sure that she's protected. Okay? Now you have to be careful because you can quickly get yourself way up on this pedestal and get this giant head about this and never sleep at night. So you have to be careful. But I think that sense of I mean, that kind of sense of protecting people, protecting information, et cetera, is a big reason people do this. And like I said, I mean, it might not be about money. It might be about your country, the organization, the cause, whatever it is the organization is doing. There's a lot of different things organizations do. And like I said, I mean, I talked about some of this already, but the profession needs people that are passionate about this right now to kind of help build this profession, right? I mean, physical security has been around since caveman, right? But still, you have things like 9/11 happen, okay? Like 2001, there's at least 2001 years of physical security history that have been happening, and you still have major issues like that happen, right? You still have things like Brussels happen, Paris happen. I mean, these things happen all the time, and these are very large, very well-established industries, right? Bridges still collapse, right? That's a major thing. We still have outbreaks of diseases. I mean, these are all very well-established careers. And then you take IT, which arguably has at least as much impact on society as any of those other areas, which is only, like I said, a few decades old. And like I said, we're kind of making this shit up as we go along. There isn't a license that you have to have to be software engineer, security person. I mean, the profession just needs people to help people kind of, or help it kind of mature and become more serious, right? Like I said, I think that we'll get to the point where there is kind of a bar exam for some of these areas, but I think that's still a ways off. So, if that's something that you're interested in, there's tons of organizations. Like I said, I'm involved in ISACA in Des Moines, because I like helping out there, but it constantly needs people to help with that. We also have an OWASP chapter here in Des Moines. We've got our next meeting coming up. If you're not on that list, let me know, and I can have to get on there. Lots of organizations to be involved in. Okay? Any other questions about that stuff? Okay, so just to throw out there, I mean, it's hard to find time to read sometimes, but you have to make time because there's so many things. There's constant. I've not got so many books that I want to read. I'm reading all the time. These are some good examples of kind of stuff focused on this area, right? Leadership, management, kind of cybersecurity side of it, even kind of the software and organizational side. I mean, even things that are kind of controversial, like The Prince, right? Have you read The Prince? You should all go read The Prince. It's like 100 pages. You can read it tonight. And I mean, people talk about Machiavellian politics and this thing, is it better to be feared or loved? I mean, even stuff like that that's kind of controversial. If you want to be a leader, if you want to have those positions in a company where you have that influence, knowing these types of things is really useful. The top one, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, is kind of a classic. Never Eat Alone, I actually just finished. That's kind of a modern day version of the Carnegie book. Emotional Intelligence, I think, is really good for nerds like me that are like, I'm angry and I don't know why. And like, go read this book. It'll help you with that. You have a comment?
I've read Emotional Intelligence and How to Win Friends and Influence People. They're both really good books.
Yeah, I mean, these are really books that I think are kind of essential. Quiet is one that I really, really like. Susan Cain actually spoke at our user conference last year. But, I mean, a lot of us tend to be very introverted. And society tends to be very, very focused on extroverts, right? We have open office plans and everything's about, like, how many people can you meet? And how many, like, go eat lunch with these people? And it's very stressful for us introverts. They're like, I just want to sit at my desk and just put code today. But you can't. That's not how it works. So this is a really good book that talks about how actually being introverted has a lot of advantages and kind of capitalizing on that and kind of fitting into kind of an extroverted world. To give you an idea, so we do the 16PF assessment at Workiva, which is a personality test. On the introversion-extroversion scale from 1 to 10, I was a 1. Okay, this is a bell curve. The guy that read the assessment back actually said to me, this guy's been this probably said, wow, I've never seen a 1 before. Great, thanks. Go back to my cube now. So yeah, like as much as anyone, I understand it. Good degree, built to last, pretty much anything by Jim Collins. These are like less technology, more just business in general. Those of you in LIS might have seen some of these. He's got a bunch, but those are two of the big ones. Phoenix Project is all about agile development, which is good for a software company. Fifth discipline is about systems thinking. So this is things like, so this is good from a security perspective because you have to realize, like my decision about what can or can't go to prod, for example, doesn't just impact the release today. It impacts the release today, which impacts this customer, which impacts their ability to file, which impacts their ability to make money for the customer, blah, 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 all the way down the line. So systems thinking talks about just thinking all the way through that kind of cascading effect, both up and down, and seeing the big picture. Against the Gods is a little bit focused on investment, but it talks a lot about the background on risk and risk management. So this whole like likelihood versus magnitude, how do you quantify risk, all of that. It's a really good one. And I mean, if you're interested in the investment side, it's good for that too. But it's also good in general. World is Flat is all about globalization. It's a good business one. 1 Minute Manager is good. Just talk about basically not being a pain in the ass to your employees. Art of War you probably heard of. Wisdom of Psychopaths is one of my favorite books because again, kind of like Prince, it's very controversial. But the Wisdom of Psychopaths is really applicable for security people because this whole kind of concept is that in society you've got sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. Okay, that's kind of the thought. And security kind of tends to be that sheepdog, right? But society, the book argues, wouldn't survive if you didn't have the wolves, right? People that push the envelope, people that do things that other people don't want to do or don't need to do. It's a really interesting book. Everybody's saying it's all about body language. Eric Navarro is a former FBI agent, and basically he's known as kind of a human lie detector. And this book is very good, based on his 4 years of experience, about reading people, reading when they're stressed, kind of detecting when they might be hiding something, etc. And getting the essence about negotiation. So, by the way, if you want, I'm happy to send these slides. I've been with Keen. Happy to send these slides out if you want to have this as a reference. Other than that, that's all the rambling I have to do. Any other questions you guys have? Yeah.
So when it comes to these very demanding certifications and these requirements, when you're in a company, how do you determine which one to spend your time on? Because like you said, 40 hours per year, that's a large time commitment, and you can have multiple certifications. How do you or the company decide which ones are needed for your position?
So it's going to depend on the company and the industry. So for example, Workiva never came to me and said, you need a CISSP. For me, it was I wanted to keep developing myself. I want to find a way to learn more about this type of thing. But other companies will. They'll say, everyone on our team must have a CISSP, or whatever it is. And I think going forward, it'll be more common because there's more pressure on companies to show that they're actually doing the things they're supposed to be, to look for certification. But I mean, it is, frankly right now, it's hard to tell. It really depends on the company and what they value. In terms of the education piece of it, there's things locally here in the area, but there are always good conferences, and there's, I can't remember off the top of my head. There's a couple of good sites that have a really good just list for the year of major security conferences. But of course, things like DEF CON, Black Hat, ShmooCon, DerbyCon, a lot of those types of conferences are usually pretty good. A lot of you have probably been through at least one of those. And all of those count for the continuing education requirement. And typically, monthly meetings of chapters and stuff typically count too. And in some cases, like ISACA even lets you count reading books for an hour here and there or whatever. So that 40 hours, it can seem like a lot, but typically if you kind of build it in throughout the year, it's manageable. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
So when you talked about the stress level can be high, which is why it leads to a lot of burnout, what kind of things do companies use to help mitigate that stress? So you say it feels like you feel okay, and you never know. So what kind of things are helping you out, do you think?
I think companies aren't very good yet at helping security people manage that. I think it really is something you have to kind of personally take on. And emotional intelligence is the book I recommend most for that. But the biggest kind of thing you have to keep in mind is just perspective on everything, right? Because every day there's going to be some emergency, and you just got to have that big picture of what battles are actually going to fight, what's actually going to hurt this company today, how much is it going to hurt, and be able to make those decisions. And being able to push back is a very stressful part. I mean, if your COO comes to you and say no, you can't encrypt that phone, right? Great. Well, now we're going to have this huge security issue. You have to be able to kind of build that assertiveness to push back. And that can help with your stress, not just kind of laying down and taking that stuff. But it's a good question, and I really think it has to be a kind of personal thing from the company itself. Yeah.
So I'm going to say some words and you're going to smile. IT is a cost center, sales makes all the money, right?
Yep.
IT, especially application development, can typically push back that no, we're not just a cost center, we're making applications. Security has a lot harder time, I think, proving it, because it is a cost center.
It depends on the company, again. So in a lot of companies, yeah, I would say that's true. I mean, it's hard to argue that complying with PCI isn't a cost center. Workiva, I think we're lucky because the business we're in requires that in order for us to sell our product, we have to go through compliance. And basically, the more certifications we can get, the more we can sell our product. But most companies don't have that benefit. So it comes back to, I mean, accounting is a cost center, but you can't get away from accounting, right? If boards don't expect us, like, God, accounting, we should eliminate accounting. Because they realize, like, part of running a business is you have to know how much money you have in the bank and how much you're spending. Security is, I think, at the same place now, but where it's lacking is in people like us being able to communicate to the board, like, why am I spending this money, how am I spending it, how do I know it's the right thing. So you probably won't ever be able to convince your executives that you're not a cost center, but being able to convince them that at least you're managing that cost well is probably one of the best you can hope for in a lot of cases. Yeah, good questions. What else? A couple minutes.
So, I like that you can all these like free books to check out. I mean, you're writing something they're really good, but it's always difficult in trying to apply it, right? It's one thing to read it and to know it and to understand it. It's another thing to remember it in the moment to sort of and actually apply it. So, any recommendations to that?
I mean, my personal approach is this kind of an osmosis thing, right? Like, I know I'm not going to remember all of the book that I read, but that's why I'm kind of constantly reading. And as I'm going through these books, it's pretty much impossible as I'm reading these to not be constantly thinking through, like, what happened yesterday in the job and, like, how to apply it. And, like, trying to apply that stuff as soon as possible, right? Trying to immediately work that back into what you're doing and just kind of make it part of your habit is probably the most effective way. Because, yeah, I mean, there's no way I can tell you everything that's in all these books now. But, I mean, like I said, I just kind of went through, I can tell you what the major ideas a lot of these books are. But, I mean, it's like any other habit, you gotta kind of work on it, build it in what you're doing before it becomes natural. I guess I mentioned that it's hard to find time and they don't really address that. I mean, the biggest thing that I found that's useful is Audible. I don't know if you guys have Audible subscriptions. It's $15 a month, which seems kind of steep for a book a month. But, I mean, my commute every day to and from work is half an hour. So I get an hour of reading in a day while I'm driving. So that's a pretty useful one. Right? The other thing that I do is I have the Kindle app on my phone. So like literally right now, if you guys were like, screw you, Ben, we're leaving, I'm like, all right, well, we've got 3 minutes, I'll sit here and read a few pages of my book, right? I always have my entire library of books with me. So that helps too. At the doctor's office, waiting in line, whatever, you just pop up and read a few pages. Yeah, good question. Anything else? All right. Well, like I said, I'm happy to make these slides available if you guys would like to see them. And I'll stick around for them if you guys have other questions you want to ask one-on-one. Thanks, guys.